What happens when the most trusted advisor to the crown becomes the greatest threat to the monarchy itself? In the kingdom of Eldoria, where tradition and honor have ruled for centuries, a single envelope containing financial records threatens to bring down not just one person, but the entire royal establishment. This is the story of how Queen Consort Isabella Ravenswood, once beloved by the people and respected by the nobility, found herself at the center of a scandal so explosive that it would shake the very foundations of the palace walls. Behind the gilded gates and ceremonial pageantry, a web of secret dealings, hidden accounts, and dangerous alliances was about to be exposed. When investigative journalist Marcus Chun received an anonymous tip about irregularities in royal charitable funds, he had no idea he was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The documents he discovered would reveal that the woman who stood beside the king at every state function, who championed causes for the poor and disadvantaged, had been living a double life that would horrify the nation. This is not just a story about money and corruption. It is about the price of power, the weight of secrets, and how one person's choices can ripple through an entire kingdom. As you follow this tale through its 5 parts, you will witness how trust can be shattered in an instant, how loyalty can be tested beyond its limits, and how even the most carefully constructed lies can crumble when the truth finally comes to light. Part 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Kensington Square as Marcus Chun hurried toward his office at the Eldoria Tribune. At 34, Marcus had built a reputation as one of the kingdom's most fearless investigative journalists. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from his rush, and his worn leather messenger bag bounced against his hip with each quick step. He had received a call at dawn from an unknown number, a voice that spoke in hushed, nervous tones about documents that could change everything. The caller had identified themselves only as a friend of truth and had promised to leave a package in Marcus's office mailbox. As Marcus pushed through the revolving doors of the Tribune building, his heart raced with the familiar excitement that came with the possibility of a major story. The security guard, Robert, nodded his usual greeting, but Marcus barely noticed, his mind already focused on what might be waiting for him upstairs. The Tribune's newsroom was nearly empty at this early hour. Only the night shift editors remained, finishing up their work before the day staff arrived. Marcus's office was tucked away in a corner, a small glass-walled space that he had personalized with awards, photographs from his various assignments, and stacks of research materials that seemed to grow taller each week. As he approached his desk, he immediately noticed the manila envelope that had been slipped under his door. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of financial documents, bank statements, and transaction records that made his eyes widen in disbelief. The letterhead at the top of several documents bore the royal seal of Eldoria, and the name that appeared again and again throughout the papers was Queen Consort Isabella Ravenswood. Marcus had covered royal events before, had even interviewed minor members of the royal family, but nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing. The documents showed a complex network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and suspicious money transfers that totaled millions of Eldorian pounds. What made it even more shocking was that much of this money appeared to have been diverted from charitable organizations that the Queen Consort publicly supported. The Children's Education Fund, the Homeless Shelter Initiative, the Veterans Assistance Program, all organizations that Isabella had championed in countless public speeches and royal appearances. Marcus spent the next several hours studying every page, cross-referencing names and account numbers, trying to understand the scope of what he was looking at. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. This wasn't just about financial impropriety. It appeared to be a systematic embezzlement scheme that had been operating for at least 5 years. The Queen Consort, who was loved by the people for her charitable work and her dedication to social causes, appeared to have been stealing from the very people she claimed to help. As the newsroom began to fill with his colleagues, Marcus knew he needed to verify the authenticity of these documents before he could even consider pursuing the story. He had learned long ago that in journalism, especially when dealing with explosive allegations against powerful figures, every fact had to be checked and double-checked. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of Sarah Williams, a forensic accountant who had helped him with complex financial stories in the past. Sarah arrived at the Tribune offices within an hour of Marcus's call. At 42, she was one of the most respected financial investigators in the kingdom, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to uncover hidden patterns in complex financial data. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the kind of conservative business attire that helped her blend into corporate boardrooms and government offices. When Sarah saw the documents spread across Marcus's desk, her professional demeanor couldn't hide her surprise. She put on her reading glasses and began examining each page carefully, occasionally making notes in a small notebook she always carried. After 2 hours of analysis, she looked up at Marcus with a grave expression. The documents appeared to be authentic, she told him. The account numbers followed the correct formats for the banks involved. The transaction codes were legitimate, and the financial patterns were consistent with what she would expect to see in a sophisticated money laundering operation. However, she cautioned Marcus that while the documents looked real, they would need to independently verify the information through other sources before any story could be published. Marcus understood the gravity of what Sarah was telling him. If these documents were real and accurate, they represented one of the biggest scandals in Eldorian royal history. The queen consort, who had married King Edward VII 3 years earlier in a ceremony watched by millions around the world, could face criminal charges that would not only destroy her reputation, but potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Marcus began the careful process of building his investigation. He reached out to contacts in the banking industry, government officials who might have knowledge of royal financial oversight, and former employees of the charitable organizations mentioned in the documents. Each conversation had to be conducted with extreme discretion, as word of such an investigation could not be allowed to reach the palace before Marcus had gathered sufficient evidence. By evening, Marcus had confirmed several key details. 3 different sources had independently verified that unusual financial activity had been noticed in relation to royal charitable accounts over the past year. A former bank employee, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that several of the account numbers in the documents were real and had been flagged for suspicious activity by internal security systems. As Marcus sat alone in his office that night, surrounded by copies of financial records and pages of handwritten notes, he realized that he was potentially sitting on the story of a lifetime. But he also understood the enormous responsibility that came with such information. If he proceeded with the investigation and the story proved to be true, it would devastate not just Isabella Ravenswood, but potentially the entire royal family and the kingdom's stability. The queen consort was not just any public figure. She was married to a king who was genuinely popular with his subjects, and she herself had been embraced by the people as a breath of fresh air in the traditionally stuffy royal establishment. Isabella had grown up in modest circumstances, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a small-town doctor. Her rise to royalty had been seen as a modern fairy tale, and her dedication to charitable causes had made her one of the most beloved members of the royal family. Marcus thought about the children who had benefited from the educational programs that Isabella supported, the homeless individuals who had found shelter through her initiatives, and the veterans who had received assistance through her advocacy. If the documents were accurate, all of these vulnerable people had been betrayed by someone they trusted to help them. As he prepared to leave the office, Marcus made a decision that would change not only his own life, but the lives of everyone involved in this unfolding scandal. He would continue the investigation, but he would do it with the thoroughness and integrity that such a consequential story demanded. He would verify every fact, interview every possible source, and ensure that when the story was finally published, it would be unassailable in its accuracy. The next morning, Marcus began what would become the most challenging investigation of his career. He started by creating a comprehensive timeline of Isabella's charitable work, cross-referencing public appearances and announcements with the financial transactions shown in the mysterious documents. What he discovered was a pattern that was both sophisticated and deeply troubling. Isabella had been particularly involved with organizations that dealt with vulnerable populations, children, the elderly, the homeless, and veterans. These groups were ideal targets for embezzlement because they often lacked the resources or expertise to conduct thorough financial audits of the funds they received. The documents suggested that Isabella had used her position and reputation to gain access to these organizations' financial systems, then systematically diverted funds to accounts that she controlled. The scheme appeared to work through a network of shell companies with innocuous names like Community Development Services and Educational Resource Partners. These companies would submit invoices to the charitable organizations for services that were either never provided or grossly overpriced. The excess funds would then be transferred through a series of offshore accounts before ultimately ending up in accounts controlled by Isabella. What made the scheme particularly clever was that enough legitimate work was actually performed to create plausible documentation. Real educational materials were purchased, genuine services were provided, and actual charitable work was accomplished, but at inflated costs that allowed millions of pounds to be skimmed off the top. To anyone conducting a casual review of the organization's finances, everything would appear normal. Marcus spent days tracking down former employees of the affected charities, many of whom had been puzzled by certain financial irregularities, but had not known what to make of them. A former treasurer of the Children's Education Fund told Marcus that she had questioned several large payments to consulting firms she had never heard of, but had been told by senior management that these were arrangements personally approved by the Queen Consort herself. The pattern that emerged from these interviews was one of an operation that relied heavily on Isabella's reputation and position. Who would question the financial decisions of someone so publicly committed to charitable work? Who would dare to suggest that the Queen Consort might be stealing from children and veterans? The scheme's success depended on the very qualities that had made Isabella beloved by the public: her apparent sincerity, her dedication to good causes, and her position of unquestioned authority within the charitable sector. As Marcus delved deeper into the investigation, he began to understand that this was not just a story about financial crime. It was a story about the abuse of trust, the exploitation of goodwill, and the way that power and privilege could be used to victimize the most vulnerable members of society. The children who had been promised better educational opportunities, the homeless individuals who had been told that help was coming, the veterans who had been assured that their service was valued and would be rewarded, all of them had been betrayed. The weight of this realization was enormous. Marcus found himself losing sleep, unable to stop thinking about the implications of what he was uncovering. He had always believed in the power of journalism to expose wrongdoing and hold the powerful accountable, but he had never worked on a story where the stakes felt so high and the potential consequences so far-reaching. By the end of the first week of his investigation, Marcus had gathered enough evidence to be confident that the documents were authentic and that the allegations they contained were credible. But he also knew that he was only at the beginning of what would need to be a much more comprehensive investigation. The palace had not yet been contacted for comment. The full scope of the financial improprieties was still unknown, and the question of how high up the royal hierarchy this scandal might reach remained unanswered. As Marcus prepared for the next phase of his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something even more shocking than what he had already discovered. The documents that had started this journey represented just the tip of an iceberg, and Marcus was determined to expose the entire truth, regardless of where it might lead or whom it might ultimately implicate in what was shaping up to be the scandal of the century. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus first opened that mysterious envelope, and his investigation had expanded far beyond what he had initially imagined possible. His small office at the Tribune had been transformed into what looked like a detective's command center, with charts, timelines, and photographs covering every available wall space. Red string connected various pieces of evidence, creating a web of connections that grew more complex each day. Marcus had barely slept, surviving on coffee, and the adrenaline that came from knowing he was closing in on one of the biggest stories of his career. Sarah Williams had become his full-time partner in the investigation, taking a leave of absence from her regular consulting work to help Marcus navigate the labyrinthine financial records they continued to uncover. Her expertise had been invaluable in understanding the sophisticated money laundering techniques that appeared to have been used to hide the stolen funds. Together, they had traced transactions through banks in 7 different countries, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led back to a shocking revelation. The scheme was far more extensive than either of them had initially realized. What had started as an investigation into the embezzlement of charitable funds had evolved into the exposure of a criminal enterprise that had tentacles reaching into multiple sectors of Eldorian society. Isabella Ravenswood was not working alone. The financial records showed connections to prominent business leaders, government officials, and even other members of the extended royal family. Marcus had spent the previous weekend in a small coastal town 300 miles from the capital, interviewing a former royal aide named Thomas Blackwell who had agreed to speak with him only under strict conditions of anonymity. Thomas had worked in the royal household for 15 years before abruptly resigning his position 6 months earlier, citing personal reasons that he had never elaborated upon publicly. The interview with Thomas had taken place in a small pub overlooking the harbor, far from prying eyes and ears. Thomas was a thin man in his 50s, with graying hair and nervous eyes that darted around the room, even when he was speaking in the quietest possible tones. What he told Marcus was both confirmation of the journalist's worst suspicions and a revelation of details that were even more disturbing than anything the financial records had suggested. According to Thomas, the embezzlement scheme had started almost immediately after Isabella married King Edward. She had used her newfound position and access to royal resources to systematically identify charitable organizations that would be vulnerable to exploitation. But more shocking than the theft itself was Thomas's claim that Isabella had not been the mastermind behind the operation. She had been recruited and manipulated by a group of individuals who saw her as the perfect front for their criminal activities. The real power behind the scheme, Thomas alleged, was a man named Victor Ashworth, a successful businessman who had built his fortune through government contracts and had cultivated relationships with powerful figures throughout Eldorian society. Ashworth had reportedly approached Isabella within months of her marriage, offering to help her navigate the complex world of royal charitable work. What had started as legitimate advice and assistance had gradually evolved into something much more sinister. Thomas described a pattern of psychological manipulation that was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Ashworth had identified Isabella's desire to make a meaningful impact through her charitable work and had slowly convinced her that the existing system was too bureaucratic and inefficient to truly help those in need. He had suggested that by working outside official channels, they could accomplish much more good, even if it meant bending certain rules and regulations. The former royal aide painted a picture of a queen consort who had been gradually drawn into illegal activity through a combination of idealism, naivety, and psychological pressure. Isabella had apparently believed, at least initially, that she was part of a noble effort to circumvent governmental red tape and deliver aid more efficiently to those who needed it most. By the time she understood the true nature of what she had become involved in, she was too deeply implicated to easily extricate herself. Marcus had left his meeting with Thomas feeling both elated at the breakthrough in his investigation and deeply disturbed by the implications of what he had learned. The story was no longer simply about a corrupt royal figure stealing from charities. It was about a sophisticated criminal organization that had targeted and exploited someone in a position of tremendous public trust, using her reputation and access to commit crimes on a massive scale. Back in his office, Marcus and Sarah began the painstaking work of verifying Thomas's allegations. They cross-referenced the names and companies he had mentioned with the financial records they had been analyzing, looking for patterns and connections that would either support or contradict his claims. What they found was a series of business relationships and financial transactions that painted a picture of a criminal network that was both highly organized and remarkably successful in avoiding detection. Victor Ashworth companies had indeed received numerous government contracts over the past several years, many of them awarded through processes that appeared to have bypassed normal competitive bidding procedures. Several of the shell companies that had been used to launder money from the charitable organizations were registered to addresses that were connected to Ashworth's business empire. Most damning of all, bank records showed regular payments from Ashworth-controlled accounts to offshore accounts that had been used to hide the stolen charitable funds. As Marcus and Sarah continued their investigation, they began to understand the true scope of the criminal enterprise they were exposing. The theft of charitable funds was only one component of a much larger operation that appeared to include government contract fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering on an international scale. The total amount of money involved was staggering. Preliminary estimates suggested that tens of millions of pounds had been stolen from various sources over a period of several years. The more they learned about the operation, the more Marcus realized that his investigation was potentially exposing not just individual criminal behavior, but systemic corruption that could implicate some of the most powerful people in Eldorian society. Government ministers who had awarded contracts to Ashworth's companies, bank executives who had facilitated suspicious transactions, and royal household officials who had provided access and information. All of these individuals could potentially face serious legal consequences if Marcus's investigation continued to its logical conclusion. The pressure was beginning to mount from multiple directions. Marcus had started receiving phone calls from unknown numbers, with voices that politely but firmly suggested that he might want to reconsider his current line of investigation. His editor at the Tribune, James Morrison, had been contacted by several prominent advertisers who had expressed concerns about the paper's editorial direction. Even Marcus's landlord had suddenly become interested in conducting an unexpected inspection of his apartment. Despite the pressure, Marcus was more determined than ever to see the investigation through to its conclusion. He had always believed that journalism's highest calling was to hold the powerful accountable for their actions, and this story represented the ultimate test of that principle. If he backed down now, if he allowed himself to be intimidated or bought off, he would be betraying not only his professional ethics, but also all of the victims who had suffered as a result of the crimes he was exposing. Sarah, too, was feeling the pressure, but remained committed to the investigation. She had received visits from tax officials who wanted to conduct an audit of her business, and several of her regular clients had suddenly canceled their contracts with her consulting firm. But, like Marcus, she understood that what they were uncovering was too important to abandon simply because it was causing them personal and professional difficulties. The breakthrough in their investigation came when Sarah was able to access additional financial records through a contact she had developed during her years as a forensic accountant. These new documents revealed the existence of a sophisticated computer system that had been used to coordinate the various elements of the criminal operation. The system, apparently designed by a team of expert programmers, had allowed the conspirators to monitor bank transactions, coordinate money transfers, and communicate securely with each other while maintaining plausible deniability for their activities. More importantly, the system had kept detailed records of all transactions and communications, apparently as a form of insurance against potential betrayal by any member of the group. These digital records provided a minute-by-minute account of how the criminal operation had functioned, including recorded conversations between the various conspirators that left no doubt about their knowledge of and participation in the illegal activities. Among the most damaging pieces of evidence were recorded conversations between Victor Ashworth and Queen Consort Isabella Ravenswood. The recordings revealed that Isabella had been fully aware of the illegal nature of their activities for at least 2 years, contradicting any potential claim that she had been an unwitting victim of manipulation. In several conversations, she had actively participated in planning new schemes and had expressed concern only about the risk of being caught, not about the harm being done to the charitable organizations and their intended beneficiaries. One particularly damaging recording captured Isabella laughing about the stupidity of the charitable organization officials who had failed to detect their theft. In another conversation, she had suggested targeting a veterans assistance program, noting that veterans were too trusting and too grateful to question how their donations were being used. The callousness revealed in these recordings was a far cry from the compassionate public image that had made Isabella so popular with the Eldorian people. As Marcus and Sarah analyzed the new evidence, they realized that they now had everything they needed to publish a comprehensive expose of the criminal operation. They had financial records that documented the theft of millions of pounds, testimony from credible witnesses who could verify key details, and recorded conversations that proved the knowledge and participation of the main conspirators. Most importantly, they had traced the stolen money through the complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, providing a clear picture of where the funds had ended up. The question now was not whether they had enough evidence to publish the story, but how to present such a complex and far-reaching scandal in a way that would be both accessible to general readers and legally defensible against the inevitable challenges that would come from the powerful individuals who were about to be exposed. Marcus knew that once the story was published, he and the Tribune would face legal attacks from some of the most expensive lawyers in the kingdom, and every fact, every allegation, and every conclusion would be scrutinized and challenged. Over the next several days, Marcus worked with the Tribune's legal team to ensure that every aspect of the story could be defended in court. They carefully reviewed each piece of evidence, verified the authenticity of documents and recordings, and prepared detailed responses to the various defenses that might be raised by those implicated in the scandal. The legal team's conclusion was unanimous. The evidence was overwhelming, and the story was legally sound. As Marcus prepared to write what would become the most important article of his career, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had started as a tip about financial irregularities had evolved into the exposure of a criminal conspiracy that had betrayed the trust of thousands of charitable donors and had stolen money intended to help the most vulnerable members of society. The Queen Consort, who had been seen as a symbol of hope and compassion, was about to be revealed as a willing participant in crimes that had caused immeasurable harm to those she had promised to help. The weight of responsibility Marcus felt was enormous. His story would not only destroy Isabella's reputation and likely end her marriage to the king, but would also shake public confidence in the royal family and potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. The ripple effects would extend far beyond the palace walls, affecting charitable organizations, government institutions, and the basic trust that held Eldorian society together. But Marcus also knew that the truth, however painful, had to be told. The victims of these crimes deserved justice, and the public deserved to know how their trust had been betrayed. As he sat down at his computer to begin writing, Marcus understood that he was about to change not only his own life, but the life of an entire kingdom. Part 3, the Tribune building, had never seen security measures like those implemented in the 48 hours before publication. Marcus's story had been reviewed, fact-checked, and legally vetted more thoroughly than any article in the newspaper's century-long history. Editor James Morrison had made the unprecedented decision to bring in external security consultants after receiving what could only be described as threats against both the newspaper and its staff. The parking garage was being monitored around the clock. All staff were required to use key card access to enter the building, and Marcus himself had been assigned a security detail that followed him everywhere he went. The final article spanned 12 pages in the Tribune's weekend edition, with supporting documents and evidence presented in a special online supplement that crashed the newspaper's servers within hours of publication due to unprecedented traffic. The headline that dominated the front page read simply, "Royal Betrayal. Queen Consort's Secret Criminal Empire Exposed." Below it was a photograph of Isabella at a recent charity gala, smiling warmly as she accepted a donation for homeless children whose aid had been stolen to fund her luxurious lifestyle. Marcus had spent 3 sleepless days crafting the article, working with Sarah to present the complex financial evidence in terms that ordinary readers could understand while maintaining the technical accuracy that would be crucial in defending against legal challenges. The story methodically laid out the entire criminal operation, from its origins in the months following Isabella's marriage to the king, through its evolution into a sophisticated international money laundering scheme, to its ultimate exposure through the anonymous documents that had started Marcus's investigation. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours of the newspaper hitting the stands, crowds had gathered outside the palace gates, demanding answers and accountability. Social media platforms were flooded with expressions of outrage, betrayal, and disbelief. The hashtag royal betrayal began trending worldwide as the story was picked up by international news outlets and broadcast around the globe. For many Eldorians, Isabella's apparent crimes represented not just a legal violation, but a fundamental breach of the social contract between the monarchy and the people. The charitable organizations that had been victimized by Isabella's scheme were among the first to respond publicly to the revelations. The Children's Education Fund, which had lost an estimated £3 million to the embezzlement scheme, issued a statement expressing their profound shock and betrayal at the allegations. The organization's director, Margaret Holbrook, held a press conference outside their headquarters, her voice shaking with emotion as she described how the stolen funds would have provided educational opportunities for thousands of disadvantaged children. The Veterans Assistance Program, another major victim of the scheme, painted an even more heartbreaking picture of the human cost of Isabella's crimes. Colonel James Fletcher, the program's director and a decorated military veteran himself, stood before television cameras with tears in his eyes as he explained how the stolen funds had been earmarked for housing assistance, medical care, and job training for veterans struggling with homelessness and unemployment. These brave men and women served their country with honor, Fletcher said, his voice breaking. To steal from them, to steal from their families, is a betrayal that cuts to the very heart of what it means to be human. The financial markets reacted with alarm to the scandal, with the Eldorian pound dropping sharply against major international currencies as investors worried about political instability. Tourism, a major component of the kingdom's economy, was already showing signs of decline as travel agencies reported cancellation from visitors who had planned royal-themed vacations. The scandal was not just a moral crisis, but an economic one that threatened to harm millions of ordinary Eldorians who had no connection to the crimes being revealed. King Edward VII, who had been touring industrial facilities in the northern provinces when the story broke, cut short his trip and returned immediately to the capital. His motorcade was met by crowds of protesters and supporters alike, with some calling for Isabella's immediate arrest and others demanding that the king himself be investigated for his potential knowledge of his wife's activities. The monarch's normally composed demeanor showed signs of strain as he was photographed entering the palace, his face drawn and his usually perfect posture slightly hunched under the weight of the crisis engulfing his family. The palace's initial response was carefully crafted, but ultimately unsatisfying to a public demanding clear answers. A brief statement issued by the royal press office acknowledged that the palace was deeply concerned by the allegations and promised full cooperation with any official investigation. The statement notably did not deny the accusations or express confidence in Isabella's innocence, leading many observers to conclude that the palace's legal advisors had determined that the evidence against the queen consort was too strong to contest directly. Victor Ashworth, identified in Marcus's article as the alleged mastermind behind the criminal operation, had disappeared from his usual haunts within hours of the story's publication. His luxury yacht was missing from its usual berth in the exclusive Marina district, and his private jet had filed a flight plan for a destination that authorities would not disclose publicly. Business associates reported that Ashworth had been making unusual financial moves in the weeks leading up to the scandal's exposure, liquidating assets and transferring funds to accounts in countries that did not have extradition treaties with Eldoria. The revelation that Ashworth had apparently escaped justice before he could be arrested added another layer of outrage to an already incendiary situation. Public protesters began demanding to know how a man at the center of such a massive criminal operation had been allowed to flee the country, leading to uncomfortable questions about whether Ashworth had been tipped off about the impending publication of Marcus's investigation. These suspicions would later prove to be well-founded, but at the time they served to further erode public confidence in the institutions that were supposed to protect them from such crimes. Law enforcement agencies found themselves under intense pressure to respond quickly and decisively to the scandal. The Metropolitan Police announced the formation of a special task force to investigate the allegations, led by Detective Chief Inspector Helen Crawford, one of the kingdom's most respected investigators of financial crimes. Crawford held a press conference at police headquarters, standing before a room packed with journalists from around the world, to outline the scope and scale of the investigation that was beginning. This investigation will follow the evidence wherever it leads, Crawford stated firmly, her steel-gray eyes conveying the seriousness with which she was approaching the case. No one is above the law in this kingdom, regardless of their position or status. We will pursue justice for the victims of these alleged crimes with all the resources at our disposal. Crawford's reputation for thoroughness and integrity gave many observers hope that the investigation would be conducted fairly and completely, but the complexity of the case meant that any resolution was likely to take many months or even years to achieve. The political implications of the scandal were equally far-reaching. Prime Minister Robert Ashcroft, who had worked closely with the royal family on various state initiatives, found himself facing difficult questions about what his government had known about Isabella's activities and when they had known it. Several charitable programs that had been publicly supported by both the royal family and the government were now under investigation, raising questions about the oversight and accountability measures that were supposed to prevent such crimes. Opposition leaders wasted no time in demanding a full parliamentary investigation into the scandal, with some calling for a complete review of the monarchy's role in Eldorian society. The Republican movement, which had previously been a small and largely ignored political faction, found itself suddenly receiving significant media attention as more citizens began questioning whether the traditional monarchical system was compatible with modern standards of accountability and transparency. Isabella herself remained secluded within the palace walls, with her whereabouts and condition becoming the subject of intense speculation. Rumors circulated that she had suffered a complete emotional breakdown upon learning of the publication of Marcus's investigation, while other reports suggested that she was working with expensive criminal defense attorneys to prepare for the legal battles that were sure to come. The absence of any public statement from Isabella herself only fueled more speculation and conspiracy theories about her state of mind and potential next moves. The psychological pressure on Isabella during this period must have been enormous. For 3 years, she had been one of the most photographed and celebrated women in the world, admired for her style, grace, and apparent dedication to charitable causes. Overnight, she had become one of the most reviled figures in Eldorian history, with her image transformed from that of a beloved queen to that of a calculating criminal who had betrayed the trust of her subjects and stolen money from the most vulnerable members of society. The impact on King Edward was perhaps even more tragic to observe. By all accounts, he had genuinely loved his wife and had been completely unaware of her criminal activities. The king, who was known for his devotion to duty and his deep sense of personal honor, found himself in an impossible position. He could not publicly defend Isabella without appearing to condone her alleged crimes, but neither could he abandon his wife without appearing callous and disloyal. The strain was evident in every public appearance, as the normally confident and composed monarch struggled to fulfill his ceremonial duties while his personal life crumbled around him. The international reaction to the scandal was swift and unforgiving. European newspapers published scathing editorials questioning the moral authority of the Eldorian monarchy, while American talk show hosts used Isabella's crimes as examples of the corruption they claimed was inherent in hereditary political systems. The scandal became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and the importance of accountability in democratic societies. Tourist bookings for Eldoria began canceling en masse as visitors who had planned royal-themed vacations decided they no longer wanted to support a monarchy tainted by such serious criminal allegations. The economic impact was particularly severe for small businesses that depended on royal tourism, from souvenir shops selling royal memorabilia to tour companies that specialized in visits to royal sites. Many of these businesses had operated for decades, sometimes for generations, and now found themselves facing financial ruin through no fault of their own. International charitable organizations also began distancing themselves from Eldorian institutions in the wake of the scandal. Several major international aid groups announced that they would be suspending their partnerships with Eldorian charities until better oversight and accountability measures could be implemented. The reputation damage extended far beyond Isabella herself, affecting the credibility of the entire Eldorian charitable sector and making it more difficult for legitimate organizations to raise funds and carry out their missions. As the first week after publication drew to a close, it became clear that the scandal was not going to fade away or be successfully managed through traditional crisis communication strategies. The evidence presented in Marcus's investigation was too comprehensive and too damaging to be dismissed or explained away. The public outrage was too genuine and too widespread to be ignored or deflected. The Queen Consort of Eldoria, who had once been seen as a symbol of hope and renewal for the monarchy, was now facing the very real possibility of criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The transformation of public opinion was perhaps most clearly visible in the changing coverage of Isabella in the Eldorian media. Newspapers that had previously competed to publish the most flattering photographs of the Queen Consort were now running detailed analyses of her crimes and their impact on victims. Television programs that had once celebrated her charitable work were now examining how that same work had been used as a cover for massive theft. The media narrative around Isabella had shifted completely and irreversibly from celebration to condemnation. As Marcus watched the continuing coverage of his investigation from his office at the Tribune, he felt a complex mixture of professional pride and personal concern about what he had unleashed. He had always believed that exposing the truth was worth whatever consequences might follow, but the scale and intensity of the public reaction was beyond anything he had anticipated. The story he had written was not just damaging reputations and ending careers. It was fundamentally changing how an entire society thought about trust, authority, and accountability. The question now was whether Eldoria would emerge from this crisis stronger and more just, or whether the damage to its institutions would prove too severe to repair. Part 4 weeks had passed since Marcus's investigation shattered the facade of royal respectability, and Eldoria found itself in the grip of a constitutional crisis unlike anything in its modern history. The Special Police Task Force led by Detective Chief Inspector Helen Crawford had expanded to include over 40 investigators, forensic accountants, and international law enforcement specialists working around the clock to untangle the web of financial crimes that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. The breakthrough that would ultimately seal Isabella's fate came through an unexpected source. Her own personal assistant, Emma Hartwell, who had worked for the Queen Consort since shortly after her marriage to King Edward. Emma, a 28-year-old woman from a modest background in the countryside, had initially been fiercely loyal to her employer, but the weight of what she had witnessed over the past 3 years had finally become too much to bear. Emma had approached Detective Chief Inspector Crawford through a lawyer, offering to provide testimony and documentation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. What she revealed in a series of interviews conducted over several days painted a picture of Isabella that was even more disturbing than what Marcus's investigation had initially suggested. According to Emma, the Queen Consort had not been a reluctant participant in Victor Ashworth's criminal scheme, but had actually suggested many of the most callous elements of the operation herself. The personal assistant's account of life inside the royal household during the period of criminal activity was both fascinating and horrifying. Emma described how Isabella had become increasingly paranoid and controlling as the embezzlement scheme grew larger and more complex. The queen consort had insisted on personally reviewing all communications between her office and the charitable organizations they were robbing, often suggesting changes that would make the theft more efficient or harder to detect. Emma's most damaging testimony concerned Isabella's attitude toward the victims of their crimes. The assistant recounted numerous instances where Isabella had laughed about the gullibility of charitable donors and had expressed contempt for the people who were supposed to benefit from the stolen funds. In one particularly disturbing incident, Emma testified that Isabella had attended a charity gala for homeless veterans while simultaneously planning to steal additional funds from the very organization hosting the event. The documentation that Emma provided to investigators included internal memos, financial records, and recorded phone conversations that she had secretly preserved as what she described as insurance against potential retaliation from her employer. Among the most explosive pieces of evidence was a recording of a conversation between Isabella and Victor Ashworth in which they discussed expanding their criminal operation to include international charities working in disaster relief and refugee assistance. The revelation that Isabella and Ashworth had been planning to steal from disaster victims and refugees provoked a new wave of international outrage that dwarfed the initial reaction to Marcus's investigation. The United Nations issued an unprecedented statement condemning the alleged crimes and calling for swift justice for the victims. Several major world leaders, including the President of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany, publicly expressed their disgust at the allegations and their support for the ongoing investigation. King Edward's position became increasingly untenable as the evidence against his wife continued to mount. The monarch, who had initially attempted to remain above the political fray while supporting his wife, was now facing calls from his own government to take decisive action. Prime Minister Robert Ashcroft held a private meeting with the king at Buckingham Palace that reportedly lasted over 4 hours, during which the political implications of the continuing scandal were discussed in detail. The conversation between the king and Prime Minister was never made public, but sources close to both men later revealed that Ashcroft had presented Edward with a stark choice. Either take action to distance the monarchy from Isabella's crimes, or risk seeing the entire institution brought down by the scandal. The Prime Minister reportedly warned that public confidence in the monarchy had fallen to historically low levels and that without decisive action, there could be serious consideration of abolishing the monarchical system altogether. The pressure on King Edward was not just political, but deeply personal. According to palace sources, the monarch had been devastated to learn the true extent of his wife's criminal activities and had reportedly confronted Isabella directly about the evidence against her. These conversations, which took place behind closed doors in the royal residence, were said to have been emotionally devastating for both parties, as Edward struggled to reconcile his love for his wife with his duty to his kingdom and its people. Isabella's response to her husband's confrontation was reportedly defiant rather than apologetic. Sources close to the royal family suggested that she had attempted to justify her actions by claiming that the charitable system was too inefficient to truly help those in need, and that her theft had actually enabled more effective use of the donated funds. This rationalization, which demonstrated a complete lack of understanding of the harm she had caused, reportedly horrified King Edward and convinced him that his wife was beyond redemption. The legal proceedings against Isabella began to move forward with unprecedented speed for such a complex case. The Crown Prosecution Service, under intense public pressure to demonstrate that no one was above the law, assembled a team of the kingdom's most experienced prosecutors to handle what was already being called the trial of the century. The charges filed against Isabella included conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, theft, and abuse of public trust, crimes that carried a potential sentence of up to 25 years in prison. Victor Ashworth remained at large, despite international efforts to locate and extradite him back to Eldoria. Intelligence reports suggested that he was hiding in a country that did not have an extradition treaty with the Eldorian government, but his exact whereabouts remained unknown. The fact that the alleged mastermind of the criminal operation had successfully escaped justice, while Isabella faced the full consequences of their shared crimes, added another layer of complexity to the public discourse surrounding the case. The emotional toll on the victims of Isabella's crimes was becoming increasingly evident as more individuals and organizations came forward to share their stories. The Children's Education Fund organized a press conference where several parents spoke about how the stolen funds would have provided educational opportunities for their children that were now lost forever. Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 from the capital's poorest district, broke down in tears as she described how her eldest daughter's scholarship to university had been canceled when the fund ran out of money that should have been available. The Veterans Assistance Program held its own emotional gathering, where former servicemen and women shared stories of how Isabella's theft had affected their lives and the lives of their families. James Murphy, a veteran of the kingdom's peacekeeping mission in Eastern Europe, described how he had been forced to live in his car for 6 months after the housing assistance he had been promised was no longer available due to lack of funds. "I served my country for 12 years, Murphy said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I never imagined that someone who claimed to support veterans would steal the money meant to help us rebuild our lives." The psychological impact of the scandal extended far beyond its direct victims to include millions of Eldorians who felt personally betrayed by Isabella's actions. Public opinion polls showed that trust in the monarchy had fallen to its lowest level since polling began, with nearly 60% of citizens expressing the view that the entire royal family should be held accountable for Isabella's crimes. More troubling for the institution's long-term survival, a significant percentage of younger citizens indicated that they now favored abolishing the monarchy altogether in favor of a purely democratic system of government. The international ramifications of the scandal continued to grow as more details emerged about the scope and scale of Isabella's criminal activities. Several international charitable organizations announced that they were conducting their own internal investigations to determine whether they had been victims of similar schemes. The World Health Organization revealed that it was reviewing its financial relationships with Eldorian institutions after discovering suspicious patterns in some donation records. The economic impact on Eldoria itself was becoming increasingly severe as the scandal continued to dominate international news coverage. Foreign direct investment in the kingdom dropped by 30% in the months following the publication of Marcus's investigation, as international businesses became concerned about the political stability and regulatory environment in a country whose institutions were being revealed as corrupt and unreliable. The tourism industry, which had been one of the economy's strongest sectors, reported bookings down by over 50% as visitors chose other destinations for their vacations. Perhaps most tragically, the scandal was having a devastating impact on legitimate charitable organizations throughout Eldoria that had no connection to Isabella's crimes. Donations to charity had plummeted as donors became suspicious of all charitable organizations and concerned about how their money might be used. The Eldorian Association of Charitable Organizations reported that its member organizations were facing an unprecedented funding crisis that threatened their ability to continue serving the vulnerable populations they existed to help. As the legal proceedings against Isabella moved toward trial, the evidence against her continued to accumulate. Forensic accountants working with the prosecution had traced the stolen funds through an increasingly complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and international transactions that spanned multiple continents. The total amount of money allegedly stolen had grown to over £40 million, making this one of the largest charitable fraud cases in international legal history. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the testimony of numerous witnesses who had worked with Isabella on various charitable initiatives and had observed suspicious behavior that they had not understood at the time. Several bank officials testified about unusual transaction patterns that had raised internal security alerts, but had been dismissed due to Isabella's status and reputation. Government officials described instances where normal oversight procedures had been bypassed or ignored because of Isabella's royal connections. Isabella's defense team, led by some of the most expensive criminal lawyers in the kingdom, attempted to portray their client as a victim of manipulation by Victor Ashworth and other co-conspirators who had exploited her good intentions and naivety about financial matters. This strategy faced significant challenges due to the extensive evidence of Isabella's active participation in planning and executing the criminal scheme, as well as the recorded conversations that demonstrated her knowledge of and enthusiasm for the illegal activities. The defense also attempted to argue that Isabella's royal status and public position had made her a target for criminals who had used her reputation to legitimize their schemes. However, this argument was undermined by the testimony of Emma Hartwell and other witnesses who described Isabella as an active and engaged participant in the criminal operation rather than an unwitting victim. The recorded conversations between Isabella and Ashworth were particularly damaging to this defense strategy, as they clearly showed Isabella proposing new targets for theft and expressing satisfaction with the success of their criminal activities. As the trial date approached, King Edward made the most difficult decision of his reign. In a nationally televised address from the palace, the monarch announced that he was seeking a formal separation from his wife and that she would be stripped of all royal titles and privileges pending the outcome of her criminal trial. The king's speech, delivered with obvious emotional pain but unwavering resolve, marked the end of Isabella's position as queen consort and effectively removed her from the line of succession. The king's decision to publicly abandon his wife was met with mixed reactions from the Eldorian public. Many citizens praised Edward for placing his duty to the kingdom above his personal feelings, while others criticized him for not taking action sooner or for failing to detect his wife's criminal activities. The decision undoubtedly saved the monarchy from even more severe damage, but it came at enormous personal cost to a man who had genuinely loved his wife and believed in her commitment to charitable causes. As Isabella's trial date approached, the kingdom found itself grappling with fundamental questions about trust, accountability, and the nature of leadership in a democratic society. The scandal had exposed weaknesses in oversight systems, revealed the potential for abuse of privileged positions, and demonstrated how even the most trusted figures could betray that trust in the most devastating ways. The outcome of Isabella's trial would determine her personal fate, but the broader implications of her crimes would continue to shape Eldorian society for years to come. Part 5. The trial of Isabella Ravenswood began on a cold January morning 6 months after Marcus Chin's investigation had first exposed her crimes to the world. The courthouse, an imposing Victorian structure in the heart of the capital, was surrounded by unprecedented security measures as protesters, supporters, journalists, and curiosity seekers gathered from around the globe to witness what many were calling the most significant criminal trial in Eldorian history. Isabella entered the courthouse looking dramatically different from the glamorous queen consort who had once graced the covers of international magazines. Her once perfect hair was now simply styled, her designer clothing replaced with a modest navy suit, and the confident smile that had charmed millions of subjects was nowhere to be seen. The transformation was symbolic of her fall from grace, but also strategic. Her legal team clearly hoped that a more humble appearance might generate some sympathy from the jury, who would ultimately decide her fate. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Crown Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell, was a masterclass in clear, compelling storytelling that laid out the government's case against Isabella in terms that were both legally precise and emotionally powerful. Mitchell, a veteran prosecutor known for her ability to make complex financial crimes understandable to ordinary citizens, spent nearly 3 hours methodically describing how Isabella had betrayed the trust of her position to steal millions of pounds from charitable organizations serving the kingdom's most vulnerable populations. Mitchell's presentation was enhanced by visual aids that made the scope of Isabella's crimes impossible to ignore. Charts showed the flow of money from legitimate charitable donations into Isabella's personal accounts, while photographs of the victims, homeless veterans, disadvantaged children, elderly citizens in need of medical care, provided a human face to the abstract financial figures. The prosecutor's voice remained steady throughout her presentation, but the moral outrage underlying her words was unmistakable. The defense team, led by renowned criminal lawyer Richard Pemberton, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose crimes had been documented in overwhelming detail by the prosecution. Pemberton, known for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to create reasonable doubt even in seemingly hopeless cases, attempted to portray Isabella as a naive woman who had been manipulated by sophisticated criminals who had exploited her good intentions and her inexperience with complex financial matters. Pemberton's opening statement focused heavily on Victor Ashworth's role in the criminal scheme, arguing that Isabella had been gradually drawn into illegal activities through psychological manipulation and coercion. The defense attorney painted a picture of a woman who had genuinely wanted to help charitable causes, but had been deceived about the true nature of the activities she was participating in. This strategy, while creative, faced significant challenges due to the extensive evidence of Isabella's active participation in planning and executing the crimes. The first witnesses called by the prosecution were representatives of the charitable organizations that had been victimized by Isabella's crimes. Margaret Holbrook, director of the Children's Education Fund, provided testimony that was both detailed and emotionally devastating as she described how the theft of over £3 million had forced her organization to cancel educational programs that would have benefited thousands of disadvantaged children throughout the kingdom. Holbrook's testimony was particularly effective because she was able to describe specific children and families who had been affected by Isabella's crimes. She spoke of 8-year-old Timothy Williams, whose after-school tutoring program had been eliminated due to lack of funds, and 14-year-old Sarah Chun, whose scholarship to a prestigious academy had been canceled just weeks before the start of the school year. These personal stories transformed abstract financial figures into human tragedy, making it impossible for the jury to ignore the real-world impact of Isabella's actions. The prosecution also called Colonel James Fletcher from the Veterans Assistance Program, whose emotional testimony about the impact of Isabella's theft on homeless and struggling veterans brought several jury members to tears. Fletcher, a decorated military hero whose own service record was beyond reproach, described how the stolen funds would have provided housing, medical care, and job training for veterans who had served their country with honor and now found themselves in desperate need of assistance. One of the most powerful moments in Fletcher's testimony came when he described meeting with individual veterans who had been promised assistance that could no longer be provided due to Isabella's theft. He spoke of Robert Jackson, a 24-year-old former soldier who had lost both legs in a peacekeeping mission and had been waiting for funds to modify his apartment for wheelchair accessibility. When the money was no longer available due to Isabella's crimes, Jackson had been forced to move back in with his elderly parents, sacrificing his independence and dignity in the process. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by the testimony of Emma Hartwell, Isabella's former personal assistant, who provided a detailed insider's account of how the criminal scheme had operated and evolved over time. Emma's testimony was particularly damaging because she was able to describe specific conversations and incidents that demonstrated Isabella's knowledge of and enthusiasm for the illegal activities she was engaged in. Emma testified about numerous occasions when Isabella had personally directed the targeting of specific charitable organizations, often choosing victims based on their vulnerability to fraud rather than any legitimate charitable considerations. The assistant described how Isabella had maintained detailed records of the criminal operation, including spreadsheets tracking stolen funds and calendars marking optimal times to execute new thefts when oversight would be minimal. Perhaps most damaging to Isabella's defense was Emma's testimony about her former employer's attitude toward the victims of their crimes. The assistant recounted multiple instances where Isabella had expressed contempt for the people they were stealing from, referring to charitable donors as suckers, and describing the beneficiaries of charitable programs as freeloaders who didn't deserve assistance. This testimony directly contradicted the defense's portrayal of Isabella as someone who had genuinely cared about charitable causes. The prosecution also presented extensive financial evidence that traced the stolen funds through the complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that Isabella and her co-conspirators had used to launder the money. Forensic accountants from several international firms testified about how they had followed the digital trail of transactions across multiple countries and banking systems, ultimately documenting how over £40 million in charitable donations have been diverted to accounts controlled by Isabella and her associates. The recorded conversations between Isabella and Victor Ashworth proved to be among the most damaging evidence presented during the trial. In these recordings, Isabella could be heard actively participating in planning new thefts, suggesting targets for future crimes, and expressing satisfaction with the success of their criminal activities. The recordings also captured Isabella laughing about the stupidity of charitable organization officials who had failed to detect their theft, revealing a callousness that shocked even experienced court observers. One particularly damaging recording captured a conversation in which Isabella and Ashworth discussed expanding their criminal operation to include international disaster relief organizations. In this conversation, Isabella could be heard suggesting that natural disasters and humanitarian crises provided excellent opportunities for theft because oversight would be minimal and officials would be too focused on immediate relief efforts to conduct thorough financial audits. The defense attempted to counter this overwhelming evidence by arguing that Isabella had been coerced into participating in the criminal scheme through psychological manipulation and threats from Ashworth and his associates. Pemberton called several expert witnesses in psychology and coercive control who testified about how sophisticated criminals could manipulate vulnerable individuals into participating in illegal activities against their better judgment. However, this defense strategy faced significant challenges due to Isabella's privileged position and access to resources that would have allowed her to seek help if she had truly been a victim of coercion. The prosecution successfully argued that someone with Isabella's education, social connections, and access to legal and financial advisors could not credibly claim to have been an unwitting victim of manipulation for a period of several years. The defense also attempted to present character witnesses who testified about Isabella's previous charitable work and her apparent genuine concern for social causes before her marriage to King Edward. Several individuals testified about Isabella's volunteer work during her younger years and her seemingly authentic commitment to helping disadvantaged populations. However, this positive character evidence was overwhelmed by the extensive documentation of her criminal activities and the testimony of witnesses who had observed her callous attitude toward victims. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Isabella's conviction was inevitable. The evidence against her was simply too comprehensive and too well documented to create reasonable doubt about her guilt. The defense's attempts to portray her as a victim of manipulation were undermined by the recorded conversations and witness testimony that demonstrated her active and enthusiastic participation in the criminal scheme. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Isabella herself took the witness stand to testify in her own defense. Against the advice of her legal team, Isabella insisted on telling her side of the story, apparently believing that her personal charisma and ability to connect with people would help convince the jury of her innocence. However, her testimony proved to be a disaster that sealed her conviction. Under cross-examination by Crown Prosecutor Mitchell, Isabella's composed facade quickly crumbled as she was confronted with the recorded conversations and documentary evidence of her crimes. Her attempts to explain away the evidence were unconvincing and often contradictory, and her obvious discomfort on the witness stand only reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of her as a calculating criminal rather than a naive victim. The jury's verdict, delivered after only 6 hours of deliberation, found Isabella guilty on all counts. As the foreman read the verdict, Isabella remained seated and showed little emotion, perhaps finally accepting the inevitable consequences of her actions. The packed courtroom erupted in applause from victims and their supporters, while Isabella's few remaining supporters wept quietly in the gallery. Judge Patricia Williams, in delivering Isabella's sentence, spoke directly about the profound breach of trust that her crimes represented and the lasting damage they had done to charitable organizations and their beneficiaries. The judge sentenced Isabella to 18 years in prison, noting that her privileged position and the vulnerability of her victims warranted a severe punishment that would send a clear message about the consequences of such betrayal. The conviction and sentencing of Isabella Ravenswood marked the end of one of the most shocking criminal cases in Eldorian history, but the broader implications of her crimes would continue to influence the kingdom for years to come. The scandal had fundamentally changed how citizens viewed the monarchy, charitable organizations, and the accountability of powerful institutions. New oversight mechanisms were implemented for charitable organizations, greater transparency was demanded from public figures, and the entire system of royal privileges and immunities was re-examined in light of how those privileges had been abused. Marcus Chun, whose investigation had started the entire process, reflected on the outcome with mixed feelings. Justice had been served, and the victims of Isabella's crimes had received some measure of vindication. However, the broader damage to social trust and institutional credibility would take much longer to repair. The story that had begun with anonymous documents in an envelope had ultimately revealed not just individual criminal behavior, but systemic weaknesses that would require fundamental reforms to address. King Edward, who had watched his wife's trial from a distance while attempting to rebuild the monarchy's damaged reputation, announced a comprehensive review of royal involvement in charitable activities and the implementation of new oversight mechanisms to prevent similar abuses in the future. The king's personal pain was evident in his public statements, but his commitment to restoring public trust in the monarchy was equally clear. As Isabella began serving her sentence in Holloway Women's Prison, stripped of all royal titles and facing the prospect of spending the next 18 years behind bars, the kingdom she had once helped rule began the long process of healing from the wounds her crimes had inflicted. The children, veterans, and other vulnerable populations who had been victimized by her theft would eventually receive compensation through a special fund established by the government. But the psychological damage caused by such a profound betrayal of trust would take much longer to heal. The story of Isabella Ravenswood serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and privilege, and the importance of maintaining strong oversight mechanisms even for the most trusted and respected figures in society. It demonstrates how the abuse of public trust can have consequences that extend far beyond individual victims to affect entire institutions and social systems. Most importantly, it shows how the courage of journalists like Marcus Chun and the persistence of investigators like Detective Chief Inspector Crawford can ultimately expose even the most sophisticated criminal schemes and ensure that justice prevails regardless of how powerful or privileged the perpetrators might be. The legacy of this scandal would continue to shape Eldorian society for decades to come, serving as a reminder that no one, regardless of their position or status, is above the law, and that the price of maintaining public trust is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse it for personal gain. The Yindi, this is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, and events depicted are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.